The night I came home from the hospital, my husband carried in my overnight bag, set it by the door, and said he needed to get back to check on things at the office. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. I had just had surgery 2 hours earlier. Not an emergency, but close enough. A ruptured ovarian cyst that had been quietly growing for months while I kept telling myself the pain was just stress. Just work. Just the way my body handled everything I kept swallowing down. The nurse had handed me a discharge sheet with instructions I couldn't focus on because the anesthesia was still wearing off, and my husband, who I'll call my husband, was standing by the curtain in his coat already buttoned up. Keys in hand, looking at the clock on his phone. "You have your mom," he said. "She's coming tomorrow, right?" I said yes. He kissed my forehead. The kind of kiss that means nothing. The kind you give a coworker at the end of a birthday party. Polite, done, already thinking about the car ride home. He was gone before I finished signing the paperwork. I sat in the discharge wheelchair while an orderly brought it around, and I looked at the automatic doors sliding open and closed, and I thought, something just ended and I don't even know how long ago it started ending. My mom arrived the next morning with soup and a rolling suitcase and took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. She just put her bag down and started making tea like she already knew everything. I didn't cry until the third day. I cried in the shower because that's the only place left where you still get to be completely alone. My husband's name is something I don't want to say here because I'm not telling this story to hurt anyone. But his father, I'll call him Mr. Hargrove, was a man I had spoken to maybe 6 times in the 3 years I'd been married to his son. He was the kind of man who felt like an institution. 72 years old. Semi-retired from the kind of work that doesn't get explained at dinner parties. The kind where people just nod and say impressive and don't ask follow-up questions. He had an office in a building downtown that still had his name on the directory and 2 assistants who had worked for him longer than I had been alive. And he wore the same style of watch every day. Not expensive looking, just permanent. Like it had always been on his wrist and always would be. I had always been slightly afraid of him. Not in a dangerous way. In the way you're afraid of someone who sees through everything and simply chooses not to comment. When my husband stopped coming home. And that's how it happened. Gradually, then completely, then a brief phone call that lasted 4 minutes. Mr. Hargrove called me. Not to apologize. Not to explain his son. He said, "I heard you've been unwell. I want to check on you." I was standing in the kitchen of our apartment, which felt enormous now, and I said I was fine, thank you. And he said, "I know you're not, but that's all right, you don't have to be." There was a pause. He said, "I'm having lunch at Caldwell's on Thursday. The one on Merchant Street. Would you join me?" I almost said no. I had 20 reasons to say no. It was awkward and strange, and I wasn't sure what he wanted, and I didn't know what version of myself to bring to a lunch with my estranged father-in-law. But I said yes. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because he was the first person in weeks who had asked me to do something specific. Not let me know if you need anything, but Thursday, Merchant Street, noon. Caldwell's was the kind of restaurant where the booths are high-backed and the lighting is golden and everyone speaks quietly because the acoustics make you feel like you should. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me. My own father hadn't stood up for me at a table since my college graduation dinner. We ordered. He asked me about my recovery. Specific questions, not polite ones. How was the pain now compared to last week? Was I sleeping? Had I gone back to work yet? I told him I'd gone back early. He said, "Of course you did," and he didn't say it meanly. He said it like he already knew me better than I realized. I asked him, somewhere around the middle of the meal, why he'd called me. He set down his fork. He looked at me for a moment in that way he had. Not uncomfortable, just considering. He said, "My son has made a significant mistake. I've watched him make smaller versions of it for years. I want you to know that what he did is not a reflection of what you're worth." I didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Also, I'm told you have a background in contract law." I laughed. I actually laughed, which surprised me because I hadn't done that in a while. I said, "I'm an associate. I do mostly M&A. He said, "I know. I looked you up." He had a legal question, a real one, not manufactured as an excuse. Something about a trust his own attorney had drafted that he'd been meaning to revisit for years. He wanted a second opinion. Not because he doubted his attorney, but because he was the kind of man who had always gotten second opinions on everything that mattered. I told him I'd look at it if he wanted. He said, I want. That lunch was the first of many, not every week. Not scheduled. He'd call or I'd get a message from one of his assistants saying he'd be at Caldwell's Thursday if I was available. Sometimes I wasn't. Sometimes I was, and I would sit across from the 72-year-old man who had more stillness in him than anyone I'd ever met. And we would talk. Not about his son. Rarely about his son. We talked about cases I was working on in the broad outlines, nothing privileged. We talked about a book he was reading. He read one book a week, always nonfiction, always something about systems, how things worked, how they failed. He asked my opinion on things with a seriousness that made me realize how rarely anyone asked my opinion on anything that wasn't a legal question. He had a granddaughter from a previous marriage of his son's. A little girl named something sweet, 5 years old, who he saw every other Sunday. He showed me a photo once. He said, "She's the only one who calls me by my first name. I don't know where she got the idea, but I've decided I like it." I asked what his first name was. He said, "Harlan." I said, "That suits you." He smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile like that, not politely actually. He said, "You're the first person who said that in about 30 years. There was a moment, about 8 months in, when I understood something. I was sitting in his office. He'd asked me to look at some documentation in person. And he was on a call and I was going through a folder at the side table by the window. And the afternoon light was coming in at that angle where everything looks like a photograph. And I thought, this is the most at home I've felt since the hospital. Not comfortable in an easy way. At home in the way of, this is where I make sense. This is where the version of me I actually like gets to exist. I kept that thought to myself. His attorney, a man named something forgettable, had started looking at me sideways during the 3 or 4 times our paths crossed. I didn't mind. I knew what I was there for. I knew what I was doing. And I also knew, in the part of me that I keep very quiet, that what had started as something practical had become something else entirely. Not romantic. Let me be clear. Not romantic. But Harlan looked at me like I was someone worth looking at. Not my youth, not my appearance, not even my legal mind. He looked at me like I was a whole person who had made a considered decision to spend time in his company, and he treated that like it was worth something. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I got the divorce papers in February. My husband sent them through his own attorney, which meant we never had to be in the same room. I read them on a Wednesday evening with a glass of wine and biscuit. My neighbor's cat, who had started sleeping at my place so often that we both accepted the informal arrangement, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I felt like someone had finally turned off a light that had been flickering for a long time. I signed them. I sent them back. I called my mother. I made dinner. I didn't tell Harlan for 2 weeks, and when I did, at Caldwell's, he nodded once and said, "Good. Now, you can stop carrying something that was never yours to carry." He paused. He said, "I have something to discuss with you." "Not today. I want to think through how to say it properly." I said, "You always think through how to say everything properly." He said, "Yes, but this one matters more than most." The conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon in his office. He didn't sit at his desk. He sat in one of the chairs by the window, the ones we usually used for informal conversations, and he gestured for me to sit in the other. He said, "You know I've been revising my estate documentation." I said I was aware. He said, "I want you to know the full scope of what I'm considering. Not because I need your legal advice on it, though I'll want that too, but because you are directly involved and you deserve to know before it's final." I waited. He said, "I have one son. He has made it clear, through a series of choices that have stretched across many years, that he is not suited to stewardship. I don't say this angrily. I say it the way I would say someone is not suited to a particular profession. It's simply not who he is." He looked at the window for a moment. He said, "I have watched you over the past year handle situations that would have broken people I considered capable. I have watched you keep your word. I have watched you show up. I have watched you extend generosity to me that you had no obligation to extend, and do it without calculation. Don't argue with me on that. I know the difference between generosity and strategy. And yours is the real thing. My throat was tight. He said, I am restructuring the trust. The primary beneficiary will be any biological children I have or my son has, which, given current circumstances, means if you have a child in the future, that child may have a claim. I am also designating a role, a formal one, for someone to oversee the foundation and the operating interests during the transitional period. He looked at me. He said, I'd like you to consider accepting that role. I said, Harlan. He said, I'm not asking you today. I'm telling you today so you can think. I went home and I sat with it for 3 weeks. I talked to my mother in the way we talk, where she mostly listens and asks one question at the end that cuts to the center of everything. The question she asked was, do you believe he's offering this because of who you are, or because of who he wishes his son had been? I thought about it for 2 days. And then I thought, what if it's both, and what if that's all right? I called Harlan on a Tuesday morning. I said, I'll accept the role under one condition. He said, name it. I said, we put everything in writing, properly structured, with your attorney present and mine, so that no one, not your son, not his attorney, not anyone, can argue that this was informal or improper. He said, I already assumed that. That's not a condition. That's just correct procedure. I said, then we have a deal. He said, good. I'll have Constance schedule it for next week. I was halfway through saying goodbye when he said one more thing. You should know that my son called me last month. I hadn't known that. Harlan said he's heard certain things about my health, about the restructuring. He said he wants to reconnect, to be more present. I was very quiet. He said I told him that presence requires consistency and that it was too late for the version of presence he was describing. He didn't take that well. I said, no, I don't imagine he did. Harlan said, he mentioned you specifically, asked if you were still in contact with me. I said, what did you tell him? Harlan said, I told him that who I spend my time with is not a subject I discuss with people who have lost the right to that information. The day the legal documents were finalized, I wore the navy suit I'd bought the winter before the surgery, the one I'd been saving for something significant without knowing what. There were 4 people in the room, me, Harlan, his attorney, mine. The documents took 2 hours to go through properly. When it was done, Harlan stood and shook my hand, which was formal, and then he said quietly, thank you for letting me do this right. I said, thank you for seeing me. That was all we needed to say. My husband called for the first time in 14 months that same evening. I saw his name on my phone while I was in the parking garage, keys in hand, standing next to my car. I looked at it for a long time. I answered because I wanted to. He said he'd heard. He didn't say what exactly, which meant he'd heard enough. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Not humble exactly, but airless. Like a room that had been closed for too long. He said, I think we should talk. I think I made a mistake. I said, yes, you did. He said, I'd like to. I said, I know what you'd like, and I want to be very honest with you. Because I think you deserve honesty even now. What you're calling a mistake was a pattern. It wasn't one night or one bad decision. It was 100 small choices you made every time you decided I wasn't worth staying for. He was quiet. I said, I don't hate you. I want to be clear about that too. But I'm not interested in a conversation about what you'd like to explore or revisit. I'm not available for that. He said, so that's it. I said, that's been it for a while. You're just now getting the news. I unlocked my car. I got in. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the garage, engine off, and I waited to feel something. Regret, or grief, or even the distant echo of the person I used to be who would have said yes. Let's talk. Maybe there's something still there. I didn't feel any of that. I felt like myself. Completely, quietly, entirely myself. I started the car. The drive home took 20 minutes. I stopped at the place on the corner and got soup, and a small loaf of bread and biscuit was at my door when I got upstairs because his actual owner had a late meeting. And I sat on the floor with him and ate my soup and thought about the fact that tomorrow I had a 9 a.m. call about the foundation's Q3 allocations and a lunch with a client I actually liked, and a conference in March I'd been asked to speak at. I thought about the fact that a year ago I was sitting in a hospital discharge wheelchair watching automatic doors slide open and closed, wondering how long it had been ending. And I thought, it doesn't matter how long it was ending. What matters is what I built while it was. I've thought a lot about cause and effect lately. Not in a dramatic way, just the quiet, mechanical way that things actually work. You do something, something follows, not always immediately, not always visibly, but eventually, everything catches up to itself. My husband made 100 small choices. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. They want one villain moment, one dramatic turning point, one night where everything went wrong. But it wasn't like that. It was the hand on my back that stopped being there. The questions about my day that got shorter and shorter until they stopped entirely. The way he looked at his phone when I was talking. The way he said, "You have your mom like that?" Settled something. Like, that was enough. Like I was a box he could check off and move on from. Each one of those choices was small. Together, they were a demolition. And the thing about demolitions is that they clear the ground for something else. I didn't plan what came next. I want to be honest about that, because I think people assume women like me, women who land on their feet, had it mapped out from the beginning. I didn't. I said yes to a lunch because someone asked me in a specific way. I looked at a document because I was asked and I was good at it. I showed up because showing up was the only thing I knew how to do when everything else had stopped making sense. What I had was not a plan. What I had was integrity, the habit of doing the thing in front of me with care, even when nobody was watching, even when there was no obvious reward, even when I was sitting in a hospital discharge chair at 11 p.m. wondering what my life had just become. Harlan saw that. He saw it because he'd spent 72 years learning the difference between people who perform reliability and people who actually are it. He wasn't looking for someone to fill a role. He was looking for someone whose character matched what the role required. And I happened to be that person, not because of strategy, but because of who I'd been long before any of this happened. That's the thing about character. You build it in ordinary moments, in the years before it matters, in the daily decisions that no one notices. And then one day, in a situation you never anticipated, it's the only thing you have. And it turns out to be exactly enough. My husband called when it was too late because he had spent years making choices that made it too late. That's not cruelty, that's consequence. The same way Harlan's trust in me wasn't luck. It was the accumulated result of every time I kept my word, every question I answered honestly, every Thursday I showed up. I think about the woman in the discharge wheelchair sometimes. I want to tell her that the automatic doors opening and closing in front of her are not a metaphor for her life being over. They're just doors, and there are other doors, and some of them open into rooms she hasn't imagined yet, with people she hasn't met yet, where the version of herself she actually likes gets to finally live out loud. The hard part is the time in between. The months of building quietly. The grief that doesn't have a clean shape, the dinners alone and the too quiet apartment, and the cat that isn't even really yours but stays anyway, and you let him because warmth is warmth. You move through it, not over it, through it, carrying it with you until it becomes lighter, until it becomes just a part of the story and not the whole of it. And one day, you're sitting in a parking garage with your keys in your hand and your phone is ringing and it says name on the screen, and you answer because you're not afraid anymore and you say what's true. And then you start the car and drive home and make soup and sit on the floor with the borrowed cat and think about the conference in March, and it's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything.